Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I found the corridor by accident on a day when I was too tired to be smart. I'd been moving like a shadow for weeks, staying off main streets, leaping in places that never felt like mine, never staying long enough to leave a pattern. The city had changed into a set of instincts. Don't silhouette yourself in windows, don't slam doors, don't walk where you can't see the next 100 feet. When the first wave of infections hit, people thought it would burn out fast. The news said clusters and containment. Then the sirens became background noise, then the sirens stopped. When everything above ground went loud and desperate, the underground became the only place that still held quiet, real quiet, the kind you can use like a blanket. The corridor was under a public works building that used to be part of a larger municipal complex on the edge of downtown Philadelphia, not far from where the old administrative annex sat behind chain link and dead landscaping. I recognized the place because my dad used to bring his pickup there for permits when I was a kid. I remembered the smell of paper and coffee, the bored security guard at the desk, the long hallway where fluorescent lights never stopped buzzing. Now, it smelled like wet concrete, dust, and something sour that had been trapped too long. I didn't go there looking for a base. I went there because I was being pushed. That afternoon, the wind had teeth. It was early winter cold, the kind that gets into your hands and makes every small task feel like punishment. I was moving along the back streets near Spring Garden, keeping to the shadow side, when I heard the voices. 3 men, close and casual, like they owned the block. Scavengers. Not the terrified kind, the kind that walked like they knew nobody could stop them. I slowed and listened. They weren't whispering, they didn't have to. They were talking about batteries, propane, and that store on the corner that still has locked cages. They were behind me and gaining, and they weren't making any effort to avoid noise. That's what scared me the most. People who didn't care about noise were either ignorant or confident. I cut right into a side lot and slipped between 2 parked sanitation trucks that had been abandoned with their hoods up. The engines were gone, stripped down to empty frames. Someone had pulled anything that looked valuable, and the rest had been left like bones. The scavengers' voices drifted past the mouth of the lot. I held my breath, kept my body tight to the truck's shadow, and waited. A minute later, a different sound slid through the air. Thin, sharp, and wrong. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a siren. It was the high, irritated moan of an infected person who had heard something and didn't like it. The scavengers went quiet. That was the moment I realized I was trapped between 2 dangers, and I needed a third option. I needed a place where the rules above ground didn't apply. My eyes landed on a service door set into the side of the municipal building. Painted metal, faded warning sign, the kind of door you never notice when life is normal. The sign said, "Authorized personnel only." There was a keypad next to it, dead and dark. I jogged to it, felt my heart pounding hard enough to shake my ribs, and tested the handle. Locked. I could hear the scavengers shifting somewhere beyond the lot. I could hear the infected moaning again, closer now, drawn in by the earlier noise. I stepped back, grabbed a chunk of broken brick from the lot and brought it down onto the keypad's casing. Not hard enough to make a sharp crack, but hard enough to break plastic and expose wiring. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe the lock was on some old mechanism that failed safe. Maybe it would short and pop open. I knew it was a long shot, but long shots are still shots. The keypad didn't do anything. I tried the door again out of habit. This time it opened. I don't know if the keypad had been purely for show, dead long before the world ended. I don't know if the lock had never fully latched. I don't know if some earlier scavenger had messed with it and left it half broken. I only know the door gave, and the gap it created felt like an invitation from a place that didn't care about what happened upstairs. I slipped inside and pulled it shut with careful hands. The air changed immediately. It went stale and cool, like a basement that hadn't been visited in years. The sound of the outside world muffled to a dull throb, still there, but distant enough that my shoulders dropped without permission. The corridor beyond the door was narrow and cluttered. Pipes ran along the ceiling and walls, some wrapped in old insulation that had started to peel like dead skin. The floor was rough concrete with patches that looked darker, like moisture had seeped up and then dried again. I stood still and listened. The moaning outside drifted away. The scavengers' voices faded. The building held me the way a cave holds a flame, protected, but always one bad move away from choking it out. I took out my flashlight, thumbed it on, and aimed it down the corridor. The beam hit a bend and didn't reach the end. That's when I understood what I'd found. This wasn't a simple basement hallway. This was a service corridor. One of those old support arteries that used to carry pipes and wiring between municipal buildings. The kind nobody thinks about until something breaks. The kind that gets added onto, patched, and rerouted over decades. The kind that ends up with doors that lead nowhere and junctions that only exist on the maintenance crew's memory. And most important, the kind that people stopped using when budgets got cut and buildings got sold. I walked in slowly, testing the ground with each step. My boots scraped grit. Somewhere overhead I heard the faint drip of water. Not a steady leak, just occasional drops, like the place was breathing. At the first bend, the corridor widened enough to fit 2 people shoulder to shoulder. A rusted wheeled cart sat against the wall, half collapsed. The flashlight beam caught a faded label on it. City of Philadelphia Facilities. My throat tightened. Seeing the city's name in that underground quiet felt like seeing a headstone. I moved deeper. The first hour was exploration. The second was calculation. And the third was the moment I stopped thinking of it as a hiding place and started thinking of it as a home. Because the corridor was dry. Not perfectly dry. There were damp stains and a few cold patches where moisture had crept in, but compared to the outside world, it was a miracle. No wind, no rain, no open windows. No glass to catch the sun and give you away. The ceiling was low enough that the air stayed consistent. The walls were thick enough that street noise became a rumor. The downside showed itself fast. There was almost no light. Whatever overhead lights had once existed were dead, and the fixtures were either missing or hanging open. The floor wasn't level, it tilted and warped where old repairs had been done. In a few places, cracked concrete revealed rebar, steel reinforcement rods, like bones under skin. And the surface grit wasn't just dust. In some areas, it was fine sand from deteriorating mortar. In others, it was tiny sharp fragments from broken tile and insulation. Unstable surfaces. That was the phrase my brain used, and it stuck. It was a place that could shelter you, but it could also injure you quietly and often. A place like that demanded routine, careful movement, a system. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't a survival celebrity. Before everything fell apart, I was a municipal building maintenance technician. Not an engineer with fancy credentials. Not a contractor with a big truck and a crew. Just a guy who knew how buildings stayed alive, how water lines ran, how power was distributed, how ventilation kept people from passing out in sealed rooms, how doors and hinges and locks failed in predictable ways. That background didn't make me tougher than anyone else. But it made the corridor speak a language I understood. At about 6:20 p.m., by the time on my wristwatch that I kept wound out of habit, I reached what looked like a junction, a wider space where 3 corridors met. One went left into darkness. One went right. One continued forward, narrower again. A metal door sat on the left wall with a wheel handle like an old ship hatch. I approached it slowly, put my ear against it, and listened. Nothing. I tried the wheel. It resisted, then turned with a grinding groan that sounded like it hadn't moved in years. I froze, heart slamming, listening for any reaction beyond the door. Still nothing. I pulled it open. The room behind it was small and bare, but it had 2 things that made my hands shake with relief. A solid floor that looked more level than the corridor, and a heavy concrete ceiling that didn't show any cracks. It was some kind of utility room, maybe a valve access space. On one wall, a set of pipes emerged from the floor and disappeared into the ceiling. The pipes were painted with faded color bands, old maintenance markings. There was a large handwheel valve on the biggest pipe. The pipe was labeled domestic water, though the label was peeling. Domestic water. Potable water, the kind you could drink when life was normal. I didn't trust it right away. Water that sits in stagnant pipes can grow bacteria. Old lines can leach metals. If pressure has dropped, contamination can seep in through leaks. You don't just drink because a label makes you hopeful. But even the possibility of water was power. In the corner, there was a metal shelf unit, mostly empty. A few old fittings sat in a dust pile. A coil of thick rubber hose lay half under the shelf, cracked but not completely ruined. I picked it up and felt it flex. It was stiff, but it wasn't crumbling. The room also had a drain in the floor, an actual drain with a metal grate. That meant if I ever had to spill water, or if something leaked, it wouldn't immediately turn into a swamp. I stepped back into the corridor and stared at the junction. This was the spot. This could be a shelter. Not comfortable, not pretty, but real. A place to build something that could last longer than a night. That first night, I didn't sleep much. I sat up in the utility room with the hatch door cracked just enough to hear the corridor. I wedged a piece of broken pipe under the door handle so if something pushed from outside, it would jam. I kept my flashlight off and used the dim glow of my watch face to orient myself. I sat with my back against the concrete wall and my hands on my knees and listened to the building breathe. Around 9:40 p.m., I heard the first sound that made my stomach go cold. Not from outside, not from the street above. From deeper in the corridor system, past the junction, from a direction I hadn't explored yet. Footsteps. Slow, dragging, uneven. Then silence. Then a faint wet exhale that did not sound human anymore, but still carried the shape of a person who had once been. I held my breath until my chest hurt. The footsteps drifted away. I didn't move until my legs went numb. That was the first lesson the corridor taught me. It was not empty. It was just hidden. Over the next 3 days, I built a routine that became my spine. At 7 a.m., I woke, whether I had slept or not, and did a quiet check of my gear. Flashlight batteries, water bottle levels, food inventory. I carried a small notebook and a pencil because paper doesn't need charging and it doesn't fail because it's cold. I wrote down everything. How many calories I thought I had, how many days until my next surface run, what I needed most, what I could live without. At 8 a.m., I walked the nearby corridor branches, marking walls with chalk taken from an old storage drawer I found in a dead office upstairs. I drew simple symbols, arrows, X marks for dead ends, circles for useful spots. I didn't write long words. Long words take time, and time is noise when you're not careful. At 10:30 a.m., I tested the air. It sounds dramatic. It wasn't. It was survival basics. Underground spaces can kill you without ever touching you. The danger isn't always a person. Sometimes it's invisible gases. If the ventilation isn't moving air, oxygen can get low. Carbon monoxide can collect if anything burns nearby. Hydrogen sulfide can seep in from sewer lines. Smells like rotten eggs at low concentrations. But at higher concentrations, it can numb your sense of smell and then knock you down. In the old world, you'd use a professional multi-gas detector. In my world, I had a cheap carbon monoxide alarm I scavenged from a hardware store and a small battery-powered fan from a desk unit. I wasn't guessing blindly, but I wasn't fully protected either. So my method was simple. I never burned anything in the corridor. No candles, no open flames, no cooking. If I needed warmth, I used layers and insulation, not fire. I kept the fan near my sleeping area and ran it in short bursts to keep air moving. I listened to my own breathing. If I ever felt dizzy, that was the rule. Leave immediately, even if it meant going back upstairs. By noon, I ate something small and boring. Canned beans, peanut butter, crackers. The same flavors over and over until your brain stopped thinking of food as enjoyment and started thinking of it as fuel. At 1 p.m., I reinforced the utility room. I scavenged materials from nearby spaces, old plywood panels, metal brackets, a thick rubber mat I cut into strips. I didn't build anything flashy. I didn't hammer nails. Hammering echoes underground like a bell. I used hand tools and slow pressure. I wedged, tied, braced, and locked. I created 2 layers of security. The outer layer was the corridor itself. I cleared loose debris from my main approach path so I wouldn't trip in the dark. But I also left certain noise traps further out. Loose metal bits placed carefully so if someone stepped wrong it would clink. I didn't make a pile that screamed trap. I made the kind of mess that looked accidental but still talked when disturbed. The inner layer was my hatch door. I added a secondary brace using a length of steel pipe that could be jammed into place from inside. If someone tried to force the wheel handle, the brace would stop the door from swinging inward even if the latch failed. At 4 p.m., I planned surface runs. Surface runs were always the same equation: what I needed versus what I risked. The corridor gave me concealment, but it didn't give me food. It didn't give me batteries. It didn't give me clean water unless I could prove the domestic water line was still safe. So I had to go up. Carefully, rarely, with a plan. At 6 p.m. I went quiet and stayed that way. That was the rule. Nighttime above ground made people reckless. It made scavengers bold because shadows felt like armor. It made infected more active in some areas, drawn by sounds and movement. Nighttime in the corridor was when I listened. And I listened a lot. By the 5th day, I had mapped enough of the corridor system to know my immediate neighborhood. There were branches that led to sealed doors, probably old building access points that had been welded shut. There were stairwells that ended at locked hatches. There were sections where the ceiling dropped and the air smelled faintly of sewage. Those I avoided. There were also places where the corridor widened into larger service bays filled with old equipment. Rusted ventilation blowers, abandoned electrical panels, stacks of broken conduit. In one service bay, I found something that changed everything. A locked metal cabinet mounted on the wall. It took me 20 minutes with a flat bar and careful pressure to pry it open without making a loud snap. Inside were emergency supplies that had been forgotten. A first aid kit, a set of high-visibility vests, a few pairs of work gloves, and, best of all, a spool of solid copper wire and a small handheld 2-way radio still in plastic. The radio was the cheap kind used for facility staff, not a long-range communication device, but it meant the people who stocked this cabinet had once thought about emergencies. I also found a headlamp, an actual headlamp, with a strap and a decent battery compartment. The headlamp turned the corridor from a fear machine into a workspace. Light doesn't just help you see, it helps you think. The corridor was still poorly lit, but now I could move with my hands free. I could carry things without dropping them. I could climb without worrying that my flashlight would roll away. I started improving the shelter in quiet, practical ways. I built a sleeping platform from 2 shipping pallets I dragged down from a loading dock area upstairs. I know what you're thinking. How do you drag pallets through an underground corridor quietly? The answer is you don't drag. You lift one end, you slide it forward a few inches at a time, and you stop whenever you hear anything beyond your own breathing. It took me most of an afternoon, and I had blisters that split open by the end. I padded the platform with layers, cardboard flattened and taped, then a rubber mat, then a thrift store blanket I stole from an abandoned apartment. On top of that, I put a sleeping bag I found in a sporting goods store that had been ransacked but not stripped clean. It wasn't new. It smelled like someone else's sweat and fear, but it was warm. I used duct tape and foam insulation strips to reduce the hatch door's metal-on-metal squeak. I didn't seal it airtight. Airtight is dangerous underground, but I made it quieter. I set up a dry zone where I kept supplies off the floor. Moisture creeps, rats creep, mold creeps. The floor is never as clean as you want it to be. I also created a small wash station using a plastic storage bin and a hand-pump soap bottle I scavenged. Hygiene wasn't about comfort. It was about infection, the regular kind. Cuts that turn bad, rashes that spread, sickness that takes you out when there's nobody to help. By the second week, I had something like stability. And that's when the other corridors started talking back. It began with sounds that didn't match the building's normal language. At first, the corridor's soundscape was predictable. Distant drips, the occasional creak as temperature shifted metal. My own footsteps softened by careful movement. Sometimes I'd hear an infected person far away, always far, always muffled, like the building was swallowing it. Those sounds became background threat, like thunder on the horizon. Then, one night, around 11:15 p.m., I heard a new noise. A metal clink, followed by a whispered curse. Human. Not from above ground. From inside the corridor system. I shut off my headlamp instantly and sat perfectly still on my sleeping platform, holding my breath and listening so hard my ears seemed to ring. The whisper came again, followed by slow, cautious steps. Someone was moving deeper underground. Someone who knew enough to whisper. Someone who cared about noise. I was worse than careless scavengers. Careless scavengers are a storm you can predict. Careful scavengers are a knife you don't see until it's close. The steps faded. I stayed frozen for another 20 minutes, then another 20. When I finally turned my headlamp back on, I kept it angled down and covered part of the beam with my hand so no stray light would leak out through the crack under the hatch door. That night, I wrote a new rule in my notebook. Assume you are not alone. The next morning, I didn't go on a surface run. I didn't risk opening the building door. I stayed in the corridor system and checked my noise traps. One of them, loose metal bits near a bend 2 corridors away, had been disturbed. Not scattered, not stomped, just moved slightly, like someone had noticed them and adjusted their step. Someone had passed close to my shelter. Someone had been aware. That's the thing about living underground. It makes you feel invisible. It makes you think you've found a pocket of the world nobody cares about anymore. But other people are desperate too. Other people notice the same things you notice. Doors that aren't guarded. Silence that feels safe. Hidden infrastructure that doesn't show up in tourist maps or street signs. Underground isn't a secret, it's an idea. And ideas spread. I needed information. So I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I set a controlled risk. That afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., I moved to a corridor junction I had labeled in my notebook as wide intersection. It was a spot where sound carried in multiple directions and where I could retreat fast. I sat in a shallow alcove behind an old electrical panel casing and waited with my headlamp off. I didn't wait long. At 4:05 p.m., I heard them. 2 people, maybe 3, moving with quiet confidence. Their footsteps weren't dragging like infected. They weren't sloppy like panicked civilians. They had a rhythm that suggested they'd done this before. A beam of light swept across the far wall. Flashlight, not headlamp. The beam paused on the pipes, then on the floor, then moved again. They were searching, not wandering. I stayed still, slowing my breathing, keeping my body tucked tight into the alcove's shadow. The voices came low, controlled. Told you this branch goes somewhere. Keep it down. If there are sleepers down here... Sleepers? Another voice, skeptical. Infected that don't move until they hear you. I've seen it. A pause. Then the first voice again. You smell that like clean air. My stomach tightened. They were sensitive to the same things I was. They were noticing the difference between stale, damp tunnels and my dry corridor. They were looking for the same advantage. Their light beam moved again, sweeping closer to my direction, then away. I could see the glow reflecting off pipe insulation like pale skin. Their footsteps approached the wide intersection, then stopped. "Hold up," someone whispered. "Look at that." I knew what they'd found without seeing it. One of my chalk arrows. I cursed myself silently. Chalk marks made my life easier, but they also made my presence obvious to anyone with eyes. "Someone's been through here?" the skeptical voice murmured. "Yeah," the first voice said, and his tone changed, less casual now. "And they're organized." I stayed frozen. My palms went damp. After a long moment, the voices shifted away from my direction. Their footsteps moved down the right corridor, not the one that led toward my shelter. I waited until their sound disappeared completely before I moved. When I did, it was slow, controlled, careful. No rushing. Rushing gets you killed underground because it makes you loud and it makes you clumsy. Back in my utility room, I sat on my sleeping platform and stared at my notebook. The pencil felt heavy in my hand. I had choices, and they all tasted bad. I could confront them, make myself known, try to negotiate. But negotiation requires trust, and trust is expensive when people are hungry. I could relocate, abandon the shelter I'd built and find another hidden space. But hidden spaces aren't infinite, and every move risks exposing you to infected, or worse. Or I could reinforce, make my shelter harder to find, harder to breach, and harder to steal. That's what I chose. Because the corridor had become my only stable thing, and stability is a drug you'll protect even when it's making you paranoid. I spent the next 2 days erasing my own footprints. I wiped chalk marks off walls near my shelter and replaced them with marks only I would recognize. Small scratches on the underside of pipes. Tiny pieces of tape tucked behind brackets. A sequence of 3 dots on a corner that looked like random grime. I shifted my noise traps farther out, in areas I didn't use often, so anyone exploring would have to pass them before getting close to my space. I created a light discipline rule. No visible light near the hatch door. Headlamp angled down only. Any work that required bright light happened deeper inside the utility room where the hatch door's crack couldn't leak it. Then I addressed the biggest vulnerability: sound. My shelter was quiet, but I still had to move. I still had to store supplies. I still had to open cans sometimes and can openers click. plastic crinkles. Boots scrape grit. So, I created a soft zone near the door. I laid down rubber mat strips and layers of cardboard to deaden footfalls. I wrapped the metal brace pipe with cloth so it wouldn't clank if bumped. I secured loose objects so nothing could roll. It wasn't perfect. Underground spaces amplify certain frequencies no matter what you do, but it made my shelter less talkative. On the third night, after spotting the scavengers, around 2:20 a.m., the corridor reminded me that careful planning doesn't control everything. I was half asleep when I heard it, a subtle scraping sound, like rubber on concrete. I sat up instantly, heart racing, listening. The scraping came again, closer. Then a soft click, not a drip, not a creak. A click like metal touching metal. Someone was at the hatch door. My mouth went dry, so fast it felt like I'd swallowed paper. I shut off my headlamp without thinking and slid off the sleeping platform onto the floor, moving on my knees to keep noise down. My hands found the brace pipe. I eased it into place against the hatch door, careful not to make it clank. I pressed my ear to the concrete wall near the door. Outside, someone breathed, slow and controlled. Then a whisper, barely audible. "It's here." A second whisper, "How do you know?" "Feel the air, it's warmer, dry." My stomach twisted. They had tracked my shelter by environmental clues, not just marks. The wheel handle turned slightly, not forced, tested. I held still, keeping my grip on the brace pipe, waiting for the next sound. The wheel turned again, more pressure this time, then stopped. Silence stretched. Then the first whisper again. "It's braced, somebody's inside." A third voice joined, deeper, more impatient. "Knock." The first voice hesitated. "No, you knock, you wake everything." The third voice. "Then we wait, people get thirsty." My skin prickled. That wasn't a threat shouted in anger. It was a plan spoken in calm. They weren't just exploring, they were hunting. I forced my breathing to stay quiet. My mind ran fast, scanning options like a checklist. I had a way out. A secondary corridor branch that connected to the utility room through an old access hatch in the back wall. I discovered it on day 6 when I was mapping. The hatch was tight and partially blocked by collapsed insulation, but it was passable if you didn't mind crawling. I also had a weapon. Not a fantasy weapon, not something dramatic. A basic pump-action shotgun I'd taken from a suburban house after the owners were gone. I carried it unloaded most of the time because accidental noise is deadly. The ammunition, 12-gauge shells, stayed in a pouch near my sleeping platform. But a shotgun in a narrow corridor is a loud last resort answer. Loud enough to bring infected. Loud enough to bring every scavenger within blocks. The corridor wasn't just a shelter, it was a sound amplifier. I didn't want to fire unless it was the only option. So I went to my better weapon, the building itself. I waited, unmoving, until I heard them shift outside the hatch. A faint rustle, a whisper too low to catch, then slow footsteps moving away down the corridor. They weren't leaving, they were repositioning. I crawled to the back access hatch, keeping my knees and elbows on the padded floor strips I'd laid. My fingers found the hatch's latch. I eased it open a half-inch, then another. Dust fell like powder. The air that seeped in was colder, and it carried a different smell, damp and metallic. The access route beyond was narrow. It forced you to crawl. I slid through, pulling the hatch gently closed behind me. In the darkness, I didn't use light. I used touch. I crawled along the secondary corridor, counting junctions by feel. One pipe cluster, then a smooth wall section, then a protruding bracket. After about 30 feet, the corridor widened slightly, enough to crouch. That secondary corridor led to a maintenance stairwell that climbed up toward another building's basement, one I hadn't used yet because the upper hatch was jammed. Jammed hatches can be forced if you have time and leverage. I didn't have time. Instead, I did something simpler. I moved to a point in the secondary corridor where it intersected with a larger branch and set a new noise trap. Not far, not subtle. A metal panel leaned against a pipe, a loose bolt balanced on its edge. Then I retreated back toward my shelter and waited. The idea was cruel in a practical way. If the scavengers tried to flank me through deeper corridors, they would make noise. If infected were nearby, as they always seemed to be in these tunnels, that noise would draw them. I wasn't calling infected like a weapon. You can't control them, but you can predict what noise does. At 2:47 a.m., it happened. A soft clatter echoed down the secondary corridor, then another, then a whisper, sharp, startled, and then, from far deeper in the tunnel system, that familiar irritated moan answered. Footsteps shifted, faster now. The scavengers, at least one of them, moved in the direction of the noise, away from my shelter. I didn't celebrate. I didn't breathe easier, because nothing in the corridor came free. A minute later, I heard frantic movement. Someone running, trying to run quietly but failing. A hissed curse, then the wet exhale sound I'd heard on my first night underground, closer now, dragged towards the commotion like a magnet. A scuffle, a hard slam against metal. A human voice whispered urgently, "Move, move." Then silence. Not calm silence, the kind of silence that follows a mistake. I stayed still in the dark, hand on the back hatch latch, waiting for the aftermath. After a long moment, I heard footsteps retreating. Fast, but controlled this time. 2 sets, maybe 3. They were leaving the deeper tunnels and moving back toward the main corridor, away from whatever they'd triggered. And they did not come back to my hatch door that night. By 4:30 a.m., the corridor returned to its slow, dripping quiet. I sat on my sleeping platform and stared at the concrete wall until my eyes burned. That was the second lesson the corridor taught me. You can survive an encounter without winning it. But you will not survive forever if people know where you are. The next week became a quiet war of presence. I stopped making surface runs for 3 days, living off what I had. When I did go up, I did it at times that were inconvenient. Late morning, when the light was harsh and shadows weren't as deep, or early afternoon when most scavengers moved elsewhere. I chose routes that didn't lead straight back to the municipal building. I looped around blocks. I doubled back. I watched intersections like they were minefields. Above ground, the city's sounds were different now. Not silent, never truly silent, but hollow. A car alarm that ran out of power mid-wail. Wind pushing trash down streets that once held traffic. The occasional distant shout that echoed and then died. Sometimes the infected moaned from inside buildings, trapped behind doors they couldn't open, still moving because they didn't understand how to stop. I avoided all of it and brought back what mattered. Batteries, canned food, medical supplies, a second carbon monoxide alarm, and, most valuable, a roll of reflective insulation, the kind used to wrap ducts or line spaces to reduce heat loss. The reflective insulation became my wall lining. It helped keep my body heat in the shelter area, and it also softened sound a little. Not much, but enough that the utility room felt less like a concrete drum. I also found something I didn't know I needed until I had it. A manual water filter, a compact pump filter designed for camping. It wasn't fancy, but it meant I could treat questionable water. Which brought me back to the domestic water pipe. By late week 3, I had to know. I couldn't keep risking surface runs just for bottled water. Bottled water is heavy. It's limited. It draws attention when you carry it. If the building's domestic water line still had any pressure, even intermittent, it could save my life. So, I tested it like a maintenance tech, not like a desperate man. I didn't crank the main valve all the way. That's how you break old systems. You go slow, you listen, you feel resistance. At 10:10 a.m., I turned the handwheel valve a quarter turn. Nothing happened. I waited. No hiss, no movement, no vibration in the pipe. I turned it another quarter. Still nothing. I waited again, hand on the pipe. In old buildings, you can sometimes feel pressure changes before you see them. At 10:16 a.m., I heard it. A distant gurgle, like air moving through a line. My heart jumped. I turned the valve another small amount. A thin trickle came from a drain spout near the bottom of the pipe assembly. An old maintenance bleed-off point. The water that dribbled out was cloudy at first, then cleared slightly. I didn't drink it. I let it run into the floor drain for 10 minutes, flushing stagnant water. Then I filled a clear bottle and held it up to my headlamp light. It looked clean. That meant nothing. I ran it through the pump filter, slow and steady, into another bottle. Then I took a small sip and waited. Not because I expected immediate symptoms, but because discipline matters. You don't gulp unknown water in the apocalypse. You test, you observe. After an hour, I had no nausea, no stomach cramps, no weird metallic taste lingering. That still didn't prove it was safe long-term, but it gave me a path. Filtered, boiled if possible above ground, and always treated as suspect. The corridor had given me water. Now it had truly become a shelter. And that's when the unmarked corridors started making themselves known. It happened in pieces, the way dangerous truths often do. At first, I noticed air movement in places where there shouldn't have been any. A faint draft across my cheek when I passed a certain corner. A smell, cold and old, coming from a seam in the wall where concrete met brick. Then, one evening, at 8:55 p.m., I heard a sound I couldn't place. A low, rhythmic thump that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Not footsteps, not dripping. A thump, pause, thump, pause. It wasn't loud, but it was consistent. I turned off my headlamp and stood in the main corridor listening. The thump continued. It sounded like someone striking something softly, or like a door being pushed and released, or like pressure pulses in a pipe. The problem was, it didn't match any pipe behavior I knew. Pipes hiss, gurgle, knock, sometimes when pressure changes, but this wasn't a random knock. This was deliberate. I held my breath, trying to make my own body quieter so I could hear better. The thump shifted position, slightly closer, slightly to the left. Then it stopped. The silence afterward felt heavy, like the building was waiting for my reaction. I did not move. After a minute, a faint scraping noise came from the left corridor branch, one I had labeled dead-end door, because it ended at a solid concrete wall with an old steel door that had been welded shut. Except now, the sound came from beyond that wall. I stepped closer, slow. I put my ear to the concrete. And I heard it, a murmur of movement, like air passing through a larger space. Not voices, not water, just presence. My skin went cold, because that meant the dead end wasn't a dead end, not truly. It meant there was space beyond it. A corridor, a room, a shaft, something that wasn't on my map, something someone else might be using. That night, sleep didn't come. I kept seeing the welded door in my mind like a warning label. I kept hearing that controlled thump. By morning, I had to decide whether I wanted to know the truth. The safe choice was to ignore it. Stay in my known zone. Don't go looking for hidden passages. Don't open doors that the city had sealed for a reason. But survival isn't just about being safe, it's about being ahead of threats. If there were unmarked corridors nearby, if people were moving in spaces I hadn't mapped, then my shelter was not as invisible as I believed. And if scavengers could find me once, they could find me again. So, at 2 p.m. that day, I did the thing I hated. I expanded. I took my tools, flat bar, adjustable wrench, a small handsaw, heavy gloves, and I went to the welded steel door. I examined the welds. They were old, uneven, probably done as a cheap security measure when the city abandoned part of the corridor system. Welds can be cut, but cutting makes noise. So, I didn't cut the welds. I looked for weakness around the frame. Old doors fail at their margins. Rust, expansion, settling. Concrete cracking just enough to create give. I found it at the bottom right corner. The door frame had separated from the concrete by maybe a quarter inch. Not enough to see through, but enough to suggest movement. I pressed the flat bar into the gap and applied slow, steady pressure. The metal creaked faintly. I stopped, listened, then pressed again. The creak repeated, slightly louder. I froze, heart hammering, listening for any response deeper in the system. Nothing. I pressed again, then again, always stopping, always listening. After 20 minutes, the gap widened enough that I could feel air moving through it. Cold air, carrying a faint smell that wasn't damp corridor air. This smelled like old paper and dust, and something else. Something human. I pulled the bar back and waited. 10 seconds. 30. A minute. No footsteps, no voices. I looked at the welds again. If someone was behind this door, they either hadn't heard me or they were choosing not to respond. I wasn't going to rip it open like an idiot. I wasn't going to announce myself. So, I did something careful. I wedged a thin strip of paper into the gap, low to the ground, and let it flutter. It moved. Air was flowing from the other side, which meant that space beyond was connected to some larger ventilation path. It meant it wasn't a sealed tomb. That was good and bad at the same time. Good because airflow reduces the risk of gas buildup. Bad because airflow carries sound. I backed away, mind racing, and made a decision that felt like swallowing a nail. I was going to open that door. But not today, because opening it meant crossing into unknown territory, and you don't do unknown territory without preparation. That night, I set up a fallback plan. If I opened the door and found danger, I needed a retreat route that didn't lead straight back to my shelter. I moved supplies to a secondary cache spot, canned food, batteries, a water bottle, hidden behind a loose panel in a service bay. I also prepared my pack with essentials: first aid, filter, spare socks, flashlight, notebook. If I had to abandon the shelter suddenly, I wanted a fighting chance. Then I slept in short bursts, waking every hour to listen. At 9:30 a.m. the next morning, I opened the welded door. I didn't break the welds. I didn't need to. The frame weakness was enough. With a flat bar and slow pressure, I managed to shift the door just enough that it popped inward with a soft, reluctant groan. A slice of darkness opened. Cold air rolled out like breath. I stood still, listening. No movement. No immediate threat. I angled my headlamp beam through the gap, keeping it narrow. The light revealed a corridor, older than mine, narrower, with brick walls instead of concrete. The floor was uneven stone, not poured slab. Pipes ran along the ceiling, but these pipes were older, thicker, and wrapped in crumbling insulation. In the distance, the corridor sloped downward. And on the wall, just inside in faded paint, was a symbol that made my stomach twist. A circle with a diagonal slash through it, and beneath it, letters I could barely read. No access. Not a modern printed sign, a hand-painted warning, the kind maintenance crews leave for each other. I stepped through. The air was colder here, and it carried a faint vibration, like the city above was still moving, even though it was dead. I moved slowly, scanning the floor. Unstable surfaces, cracks, loose stone, hidden holes. This corridor was older and less maintained than my main zone. One misstep could mean a twisted ankle, and a twisted ankle underground is a countdown. The corridor ran about 40 feet before it reached a junction. And there, carved into the brick in crude letters, was something that froze my blood. Turn back. Below it, someone had scratched a date, 2011. That meant this corridor had been avoided long before the outbreak. It meant there had been a reason to fear it when the world was still normal. I stood there, headlamp beam trembling slightly, and listened. From somewhere deeper, past the junction, came a faint sound. Not footsteps, not dripping, a low, steady hum, like a ventilation fan still turning somewhere. Which was impossible. Unless someone had power. Unless someone was living down here. I backed up one step, then another, scanning the brick walls for anything else. Marks, warnings, signs of recent movement. And that's when I saw it. Fresh scuff marks on the stone floor, not dusty, not old. Boot marks, recent. Someone had walked this corridor recently, and they hadn't bothered to erase their trail. That meant confidence. Or a trap. I turned my headlamp beam off the floor and aimed it down the corridor slope. For a split second, the light caught something reflective far away, like a small piece of tape or metal. Then the light moved slightly and the reflection disappeared. My instinct screamed at me to retreat. My brain whispered that curiosity gets people killed. So I did the only thing that had kept me alive so far. I went back to routine. I retreated to my shelter, resecured my hatch door, and sat down with my notebook. I wrote down everything. The old corridor's brick walls, the turn-back warning, the date, the hum, the scuff marks, the reflection. Then I wrote a line under it, hard enough that the pencil dug into paper. There are people deeper underground. I didn't know if they were survivors hiding from the world. I didn't know if they were scavengers building their own base. I didn't know if they were dangerous because they had to be, or dangerous because they liked being that way. But I knew one thing for sure. My shelter wasn't the only shelter. And now that I'd opened that door, I had connected my quiet world to theirs. For 2 days, nothing happened. No footsteps at my hatch. No whispering near my junction. No signs of pursuit. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the hum. Then, on the third night, at 1:05 a.m., I heard the thump again. Closer this time. Thump, pause, like someone tapping a pipe with a tool. Then, from the old corridor's direction, a sound that didn't belong anywhere underground. A soft, controlled cough. Human. I shut off my headlamp and held my breath. The cough came again, followed by a whispered voice that seemed aimed at the brick itself, like they knew sound traveled through walls. Hello? My skin prickled. My mouth went dry. They were close enough to speak and be heard. They knew someone was here. I stayed silent, mind racing, weighing risk. If I responded, I made myself real. If I didn't, I might invite them to come searching. The voice came again, slightly louder, still controlled. I'm not looking for trouble. A pause. Then, if you're living in the dry section, we need to talk. My heart hammered against my ribs like it wanted out, because that meant they knew exactly what I was. Not my name, not my face, but my advantage, my dry corridor, my shelter. I gripped the brace pipe, feeling the cloth wrap under my fingers, and stared into the darkness. In that moment, isolation stopped feeling like safety. It started feeling like a fragile agreement I hadn't signed, and someone else was now trying to renegotiate. I didn't answer that night. I waited until morning, when I could think in daylight rules, not nighttime fear. At 9:40 a.m., I ate a small meal and forced my hands to stop shaking by doing simple tasks: repacking supplies, checking batteries, cleaning my water bottles. Routine is how you keep panic from driving. At 11:15 a.m., I went back to the welded door and listened. Nothing. At 11:30 a.m., I returned and listened again. Still nothing. At noon, I made a decision. If they wanted to talk, I was going to control where and how. Not at my hatch door, not in my shelter. Not with them having the advantage of knowing my location while I knew nothing about theirs. I chose the wide intersection as neutral ground. At 2 p.m., I went to the intersection and set up a simple signal. I placed my flashlight on the floor with its beam aimed at the wall, turned on low, not pointing down the corridor like a weapon, just visible. Then I stepped back into my alcove and waited. At 2:26 p.m., the light beam shifted, someone passing through it. A figure emerged from the old corridor branch, moving slowly, hands visible. The person was wrapped in layers, face partly covered by a scarf. They held a flashlight pointed down, not at me. Behind them, another figure lingered in the shadows, staying back. The first person stopped at the intersection and spoke softly. "I'm Mara," she said. Her voice sounded tired but steady. "I used to work for the water department. Infrastructure planning." I stayed in the alcove's shadow. I didn't show myself yet. Mara continued, "We heard you. Not at first, but the dry air gave you away. And your traps. You're careful." A pause. "We're not here to take your space, we have our own. But we're running into problems deeper down. And you've got something we don't." My throat tightened. Water, dry shelter, tools. I finally spoke, keeping my voice low and calm. "What do you want?" Mara didn't flinch. "Trade, information, maybe cooperation." The second figure shifted in the shadows. Mara glanced back briefly, then returned her focus to the alcove where she knew I was hiding. "There are corridors down there that aren't on any city plans," she said. "Old stuff. Some of it predates modern mapping, and some of it doesn't make sense." I felt a cold pinch of recognition. "The thumping," I said before I could stop myself. Mara nodded slowly. "Yeah." A long silence stretched. Then she said, "We think there's another group. Not ours, not yours. They moved through the unmarked parts. They've been stealing supplies, setting false trails, and they've started pushing infected toward our side like it's a game." My stomach turned. That matched what had happened the night my noise trap drew infected. It hadn't felt random. It had felt exploited. Mara took a small step forward, careful not to sound threatening. "I'm not asking you to become family," she said. "I'm asking you to survive smarter. You're alone up here. That makes you vulnerable. We're a small team. That makes us visible. But together, we might be able to map the unmarked sections and cut off the people using them." I stayed silent, mind running. Mara's words sounded reasonable. But reasonable can still be a trap. I asked the only question that mattered. How many are you? Mara hesitated just long enough to be honest. 5, including me. And the other group? I asked. Mara's eyes flicked to the corridor slope behind her. We don't know, at least 3, maybe more. I breathed slowly. 5 people meant resources, skills, and risk. It meant noise. It meant conflict. It meant potential betrayal. But it also meant I wasn't the only one hearing things in the walls. Mara waited, letting silence do its work. Finally, she said, You don't have to answer right now. But you should know something. Her voice lowered. They know you're here now, not just us. My stomach clenched. Mara continued, You opened that welded door. Once you connect corridors, you connect attention. They've been watching the dry section for days. They didn't approach you because they were waiting to see if you'd lead them somewhere. I felt anger spark in my chest. Anger at myself, at the corridor, at the way survival punishes curiosity. Mara raised her hands slightly, a gesture that tried to be peace. We're offering you a choice before they force one. Then, she reached into her pocket slowly and set something on the ground at the intersection. A small package wrapped in plastic. Antibiotics, she said. Not a gift, a down payment. You decide if you want to talk again. She stepped back. The second figure behind her shifted, still silent. Mara's eyes stayed on the alcove. If you don't come, she said softly, at least move your shelter, because they've been getting closer. Then she turned and walked back into the old corridor, her footsteps careful and controlled. The second figure followed, disappearing into the brick darkness like it had swallowed them. I stayed in my alcove until their light was gone. Then I walked to the package and picked it up. It was real. A labeled bottle inside. The kind you only find in clinics and pharmacies, not on random scavenger runs. That meant Mara's group had access to places I didn't. Or they had been planning this approach carefully enough to bring a convincing prop. I carried it back to my shelter and sat on my sleeping platform, staring at the hatch door. My mind tried to cling to the comfort of routine, but routine was cracking. The corridor system was changing. Not physically, concrete doesn't move fast, but socially. The underground was becoming contested space. And contested space turns hidden shelters into targets. That night, at 10:40 p.m., the corridor delivered proof. A faint scraping sound near the main corridor bend. Then a soft clink, one of my moved noise traps, disturbed. I shut off my headlamp and held still. A whisper drifted down the corridor, not from Mara's direction. A different voice, low and amused. Found it. My blood went cold. The whisper came again, closer now. Thought you were clever. Then the thump started, rapid now, not slow. Thump, 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 like someone striking a pipe with impatience. And from somewhere, far off, deeper in the tunnels, infected moans answered, drawn toward the sudden rhythm. My hands moved without conscious thought. Brace pipe, pack, water bottle, flashlight, notebook, filter. The secondary back hatch was my only quiet exit. As I slid off the sleeping platform, I understood the truth that had been sitting under every day of false calm. A shelter is only safe until someone else decides they want it. I didn't know if I could trust Mara. I didn't know if her group was an answer or just a different kind of problem. But I knew I couldn't stay where I was, because the corridor that nobody used anymore had stopped being forgotten. And in the underground, being remembered was the beginning of being hunted. I eased open the back hatch, let cold, damp air kiss my face, and crawled into the dark, moving toward the unmarked corridors, toward the hum, toward the people behind the walls, because staying hidden had become harder than taking a risk. And somewhere behind me, in the dry section I'd built into a home, a quiet laugh echoed off concrete like a signature. They weren't lost. They were looking. And now they knew exactly where to start. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.